my very, very senior colleague, friend, philosopher and guide, Dr. Surjit Bhillar, to make his opening remarks. He spoke at ModiNomics, so it's very appropriate that he speaks at 9 years of ModiNomics and it delivers.
The theme of this seminar is the state of inclusive growth, and in particular, whether Modi has delivered on inclusive growth. Which means that we need to define, and I'll try and do that in the next 2-3 minutes, what inclusive growth is. Actually, it's not very difficult to define. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Basically, does everyone benefit from the growth process? So that's a very clear demarcation of what we need to study in order to find out whether this indeed has happened. And there's a related story, whether it happened and to what degree did it happen before. So we've had, you mentioned about the reform process, how you were a child of reforms. 1991 did set India apart from what had happened in the previous 40 years. So this is now, almost 30 years and counting towards, if you will, the 40 years post-reforms. Now, we live in an age where data is the new oil. We all grew up at a time in the mid-70s when oil suddenly appeared on the scene and was a mega income driver for some few countries. But today, data is the new oil, and that is what the study of inclusive growth entails, to look at data. But also, we have AI, and we have fake news. And to compound it further, we have fake commentary. So I hope we will be able to look at the evidence and identify what is fake commentary, what is fake news, and what is the reality. That's the challenge for all of us. We all receive the data, we can all process the data, we all do process the data. But I think the important objective is to identify what is fake, what is real, and what is just commentary. So I'll just conclude with just 2 points, or 2 identifiers. There is a macro identifier of inclusive growth, and there's a micro identifier of inclusive growth. The macro identifier has to do with growth, the total growth, inflation, because as we know that high inflation hurts the poor, the bottom half. That's where the inclusive growth comes in, and whether the inflation, if you will, has been inclusive or not. So that's the macro side. In addition, a third element on the macro side is taxation, which is, are the, those who are better off, are they paying their fair share of taxes? And if not, why not, etc. So that's, if you will, the macro dimension of inclusive growth. The micro dimension is to look at caste, look at gender, look at religion, and see how the different classifications, if you will, have progressed in terms of their income and the benefits from the state. There is the additional element of, now he warned us all about the freebies. We'll have to see what entails. So far, we've had a limited amount of freebies, but I do agree with you that the dangers are quite apparent as to where this might end up. Also, last concluding comment about the inclusive growth. This is an election year, and funny things happen around the world, and particularly in India, during national election years. Though there is also the disturbing element in India that almost every year is an election year. So Therefore, fake commentary and fake analysis has a very receptive audience all the time. Hopefully that will lessen in the future, but in this particular year, I think we all have to be very, very careful with our analysis and with our presentation and our interpretation of data on inclusive growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Surjit. Deming once famously said, "In God we trust, rest everybody must bring data." And data has always been in short supply in India. We are not a data abundant country thus far. And whatever data is published also gets different interpretation. So even if you say this is the data, and the data says the jobs have gone up for one economist, the same data is used by another to say the jobs have gone down. And on top of that, you have this complicating factor that Surjit mentioned of fake data. So here there is a problem already with the real data, and we are not being able to manage that. So how will we manage the fake data? So with that, I would move on to Dr. Subhash Chandra Garg, former Finance Secretary and Economics Affairs Secretary. So to your mind, what are the indicators of inclusive growth? And if you'd like to elaborate from your perspective, how it has panned out over the last 10 years.
Thank you very much, Samir, for inviting me on this occasion. The theme of the seminar, the discussion, is the inclusive growth. I think there are three dimensions to it, which are, in fact, interwoven in your theme. The inclusive growth, inclusive development, and inclusive governance. These are all interwoven into whenever we discuss. So inclusive growth, to my mind, is the country grows at a higher rate, and then this is distributed. The growth is distributed well amongst the people. So that is the inclusive growth dimension. It's not only sort of, as you were also mentioning, cornered by a few million people or 1 or 10% of the population. The bottom 50% or 60% doesn't receive that kind of growth which is there. Basically, growth is nothing else than GDP is our collective income put together, and incomes of the household together makes that total income. So if the poor households receive lesser income, they are deprived, they are not part of that country is not having the inclusive growth. From that point of view, if we look at the record of last 10 years, after the reforms were sort of initiated in 1991, which unleashed the growth momentum in the country. So what I find is that the growth momentum in first 5 years, the first term was much higher. But in the second term, you may attribute to whatever reasons you say, COVID or whatever, the 5-year growth would be surprisingly only about 4.5%. That's a very low growth for the country. Now, as far as sharing of the growth is concerned, the data is not that great. We don't have the consumption survey. We have this multidimensional poverty index data, which shows up that from 2005 onwards, the pace of reduction in MPI is fairly even. There is no spectacular jump in the last, in this current year's term. So, and the evidence, other evidence, if you look at it, the fact that we have to feed 80 crore people with basic minimum cereal, the fact that still Narega attracts about 10 to 11 crore households to find that backstop work. If they had work, they wouldn't come to the Narega. That's the whole point. Likewise, if you look at other pieces of information, you still feel that the last mile, the poor people, the kind of data which is thrown up in terms of the malnutrition, our own health survey tells you, if you look at the MPI alone, and only one element of malnutrition or undernutrition, there are about 40-45% of the Indian households rated as undernourished. So the growth and distribution record is mixed in my mind, not a very great record. I move to the second aspect, which I said, inclusive development. There, the development to my mind would mean that the poor households, the non-inclusive households, get the abilities and the assets to be able to earn income, and that is what, if the government policies and the government programs can enable. From that point of view, my sense is that there have been several good programs which the government has run under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, whether you take it housing program or you take it electricity program, gas universalization, health program, toilets program, and now the Jal Jeevan program. So I think these have been massive enablers of creating abilities in people to be able to run, to earn more. Whether that has been translated into incomes, as I said, the evidence is not that great. But in itself, these programs have improved the quality of life very much. And therefore, on development record, to my mind, the government seems to have done very, very well. There is another aspect of development which is into how do you bring about education, transformation, digital empowerment, because that is the future, or for that matter, skill endowment for being able to earn higher incomes and all. There, to my mind, the record has not been that good. Our education programs have not delivered that much. In fact, government has reduced funding. The skill program, surprisingly, has virtually collapsed, if you would look at it. Not that the skill program as being run earlier was anything great, but there was a lot of expectation that this skill program will be. So from the development perspective, while half of the story in terms of creating better life conditions, because if you have roads, if you have lights, etc., you can study better, you can do better, you can go for jobs elsewhere, your movement enables. So I think from the development, there is more pluses than minuses, but this is a good record to talk about. The last aspect of the inclusive governance, and that is where, to my mind, the questions about taxation, the question about the freebies and other things come in. I think the dimension which we should be looking at in terms of governance is that, are you able to tax, from the economic perspective, are you able to tax the rich or those who have higher incomes and wealth, and transfer it to those who, unfortunately, because of physical or mental conditions, are not in a position to earn, and those who are temporarily not in a position to earn are unable to earn by skill transfers, etc. I think that is where, to my mind, the entire story comes in. If you look at the taxation, I think government has done well in terms of rationalizing corporate taxes and all. Individual taxes have become a little more complicated, but in this era of highly computerized environment, etc., it may not make that much difference. But one area where I found we have not done well, and we have actually regressed, is the abolition of wealth tax in the country in 2015 by this very government. In fact, we needed to bring a better wealth tax. Today, if our GDP is 3 trillion, the national wealth is about 15 trillion. And we are not taxing that wealth at all very well. There's some minor capital gains taxation, etc. But by and large, the wealth goes completely untaxed. On freebies, and that is when I'll finish my interventions, I don't view freebies as something inherently bad. Freebies is to take care of that redistribution aspect, because if a large number of or fraction or section of your society is not able to earn income to live a reasonable standard of life or a minimum standard of life, for some time, to those who can be made to earn later, and for those who are not able to earn, to transfer them, whether it's old, widows, or physically handicapped, or whatever you may say. The question in freebies, to my mind, is targeting. If you provide it to undeserved people, I don't understand why we have 80 crore people receiving free food grains. 80% of them don't deserve this one. Likewise, why do we have all the 9 crore farmers being given this Prime Minister Samman Nidhi kind of payment? Likewise, electricity, water in Delhi, to almost everyone with a certain level of consumption, rich, poor. This makes no sense to me. So I think in freebies, within the space which the governments have, you should be able to design a good freebie, targeted freebie program, distribution targeted to the poor. If that happens, that's fine. My sense is that since states face a much larger constraint in terms of the fiscal ability, they cannot design the big giveaways. It is the center which has no such restriction, and that is why it spills into the fiscal deficit, etc. So center should be more careful at designing the freebies program. Thank you very much.
So let me move on to Anil Bhardwaj, who represents a perpetually distressed sector called MSME, but it's also a never say die sector. So are we more distressed, less distressed, life as usual, 10 years, Mudra Yojana, Swadhini Yojana, and so many Yojanas? How has EGLS and how has this panned out with ModiNomics?
I think I would begin by saying it is relatively better. But let me spend a few minutes about ModiNomics. What I gather is that it could be better understood by stating what it is not. For example, it certainly is not Marxist. It certainly is not laissez-faire. And it has a mix of neoclassical and Keynesian and some new elements thrown in which are quite sui generis in Indian context, freebies being one of them. And I think Modi has taken some bold steps, and the upside of which has been very apparent, especially GST. And see, for MSMEs, the earlier taxation system was a nightmare. I'll just give you an example so that people who are not from business background, they can appreciate the difficulties businesses faced. For example, a simple thing like pen would be termed differently in different states. It could be a writing instrument in one state, a pen in another, pen with a gel ink in another, pen with a liquid ink in another, and all having different taxation. So whenever a lorry would be passing from one state to another, the tax department would stop it and would try to interpret it, and based on the initial bill and the difference of the, you can say, taxation in the coming state, they would
have the penalties and they will stop, and then they would be bargaining, and then things would be sorted out, and after maybe the lorry is standing there for maybe 1 day or 2 days, it would pass. It was perpetual nightmare. That is completely gone. People have forgotten about it. So India has become one market. So a pen is a pen, whether it is Kanyakumari or Kashmir. That is very, very important thing. It has one taxation, no matter how you interpret it. So it has certainly eased life of small businesses tremendously, that they have been able to do business beyond their own state. Earlier, majority of them used to supply goods within the 80, 100 kilometers periphery. Now, the southern Indian products are in northern India, northern Indian products are in southern India, and so on and so forth. Another major upside has been his push on the digital front. And you already mentioned whether it is GEM Trinity or whether it's UPA or all digital platforms that he has used for increasing financial inclusion. And if we really look at certain parameters of MSME growth, I mean MSME's contribution to GDP during the Manmohan era and Modi era, there's not much of difference. There is incremental positive side. If similarly, if you look at the number also, in terms of people employed, there is an incremental increase, but again, there is no great difference. When you look at the number of MSMEs during the Manmohan era and Modi era, there is substantial increase, but that's largely because of the increase in the frame, because the traders are included, so the numbers are swelled. But the moment it comes to financial inclusion, it has almost become troubled. And that is, I think, a major success story during this era. The one side why I have not been totally positive, it is because of certain areas have been left out, or we had not been able to move. One is because I think this regime has not been able to build consensus for reforms, whether it is agriculture, whether it is other, like for example, privatization of PSUs. And I'm not saying because just, I mean, it's a purely economic debate, but privatization of PSU means freeing of the inputs for MSMEs. For example, banks. Now 70% of the banks are in public sector. Now that means it is basically one single entity because their processes are the same. Similarly, steel. If steel is in the government sector, so it is reporting to a ministry, and the minister has a presence in the cabinet, and its bargaining power or its lobbying power is, I mean, very great in terms of the very specific steel sector. So it is protected. So is aluminium. So is copper. So is polymer, plastic raw material. All this put together increase the cost of production for MSMEs. And bring in the finance, it increases further. So it subdues the competitiveness of the MSME sector, and that is why, whether it is Manmohan era or whether it is Modi era, one thing has stayed almost constant. It is percentage of manufacturing in GDP. That has remained almost constant. And that is because that we have still not been able to build the growth momentum in these sectors. One thing that he has tried, and it is, I think, is reforms by stealth, I would say, is that instead of opening up these markets for inputs and inducing competition in them to make industry competitive, what we have done is we have relied more on the protection side. So certainly, quality control orders have increased, the barriers have increased. It has provided some succor to domestic manufacturing, and through that we have tried to attract investment through PLIs and to make in India. Hopefully, they would also, perhaps, I mean, this is what is felt, that they would be able to create the manufacturing base, which eventually in future would generate jobs and employment and also create linkages to the MSMEs. It is in the future, but I think overall it has been positive.
Thank you very much, Anil. We move on to Charan Singh ji. Charan Singh ji, how do you see the whole thing having panned out?
So let me start with an anecdote. I was, as you mentioned in my introduction, I was working at the IMF in 2009 as a senior economist evaluating various schemes of the IMF. One of the schemes, I had to go and meet the executive director of a country which is a major oil producing country. While talking to him about the issue of foreign exchange reserves, he came back to me And he said, well, Dr. Singh, I'm not ready to share all the information that you're looking for. And I said, why? And he said, look, the oil which is lying under my soil does not belong to only me and my generation. It is there because the past 100 generations, because of which the oil is there. And this oil belongs to probably next 100 generations which have no say today. So how should I price the oil? How much should I drill and bring it out? I'm not in a position to tell everything that you are seeking, because that has an implication on international reserves. It is in 2010, and I started thinking, what does sustainability mean? In economics, we had always been thinking about sustainability in terms of one generation or two generations. The climate catastrophe had yet not hit the world, which happened much later. Now, of course, we're in the midst of it. Nobody had thought about carbon footprints. And here is the executive director from this country who's talking about sustainability intergenerational. With this anecdote, let me move on to what has happened in the last 10 years. While you are talking about sectoral things, you're talking of fiscal, the monetary, and I have certain things to say on this. And now you're talking about financial inclusion, the area in which I have worked extensively, both while I was at the bank, and I'll have a point or two to make towards the end. The most important contribution, I think, that has happened in the last 10 years is India connecting with its roots. That is the most important thing. And that became so apparent in G20 meeting when the Prime Minister, of course, a little earlier, but it became so apparent in the G20 meetings when he spoke about life. The life for sustainable basis, where we spoke about the Indian culture, we spoke about Indian sustainability issues, where we spoke about the flora and fauna, and we said how we connect across so that we are able to tackle these issues which are now emerging in terms of climate and all that. So to me, the first thing that has happened, Indians getting connected to their roots and taking pride in the fact that the culture that they have has been sustainable for thousands of years without bringing it to the climate crisis that within 300 years industrial revolution has brought us to. The second point which you mentioned, and I think this is something really celebrating, because 1983 I started my career as a commercial banker, and all the nationalization that had happened in 69 and 80 was for banking penetration in rural areas. It wasn't happening. In 2012, the money lender was still coming back and rising. Its share in the rural finance was rising. And I myself did a study at the Reserve Bank of India in 2008, which later on Rangarajan started with the National Mission on Financial Inclusion, his famous report. There's a precursor to that report done within the RBI. We found that in the rural areas, hardly 33% people had bank account. Today the scene has changed. Under Jan Dhan, we have 51 crore people having accounts, 28 crore women having a bank account, business correspondents are doing exceedingly well, 2 lakh crore rupees outstanding happening in the Jan Dhan account. Now you were talking about the digital, this could have happened only because we brought in the JAM Trinity. So the point that I'm trying to make in financial inclusion, despite the nationalizations of 69 and 80, we made a big step forward and we converted all this. The other point that I want to also make, and that's the third point, is the pressure that India was during COVID of the fiscal stimulus. The government stood its ground and said, nothing doing, we can only afford this much and nothing more. And even at that fiscal stimulus that we announced, we had capital expenditure in mind. If you look at the overall fiscal stimulus in other countries, and look at India, very modest, but very well targeted. Dr. Surjit Bhalla did a study on that, where he said that people would have driven into the poverty once again, but the food subsidy, as well as the free rations that were provided, they have helped people not get into that trap of poverty again. And one thing is still missing. the health facilities which the Modi government opened, free vaccines, and the health facility, private and public hospitals had to open up. That has yet not been accounted, quantified, and figured in. Otherwise, health expenditure is another expenditure which drives people into poverty. So the fiscal sustainability issue that came up resulted 2 years later in inflation. And you are right when you mentioned inflation is something which hurts everyone and hurts financial inclusion very badly. India's inflation rate, around 6%, is the 30-year average. Whereas America, UK, Euro, around 10% inflation that they recorded is 5 times their previous 30-year average. They have hardly averaged 2%, and this time it all reached. And this inflation that these countries did suffer was just not because of disruption in global value chain, just not because of COVID. They had building up very irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy that they pursued from 2008 onwards. The last point I want to make on the Modi economics is, and there is one worry I have, which I'll come back, but the last point I want to make is the point which has just been mentioned, but I want to emphasize India becoming one market. That's very, very important. He gave the example of an octroi and octroi post, how they would get distorted and disturbed. But now, with Niti spreading into other states, the dream that the Prime Minister has, or the whole country has, we are not only thinking of 5-year plans, which we were doing since 1950, but now we have a vision of something 25 years from now. We can plan well, we can target well. And I did this exercise, I must mention this, for Niti Aayog on 2047. We broke it in 2036, 37, and then 46, 47. We have given them about 1,500 pages. 15 professors from across the country have worked on that study. We found it's a challenge. No other country in the world had even attempted it. But here in our country, we are thinking, we may call it with whatever term we want, Amrit Kal or whatever, but here is a vision, here is a leader who is telling us that, well, while we need to do short-term planning, we need to have a vision of where we are heading 100 years when we celebrate. I'm a little worried, Samir, along with you. You know that the subprime crisis of America was a result of over-financialization. Over-financialization, like overeating, can be very harmful. At this point of time, RBI's caution in the circular that they had yesterday, raising the risk weights on consumer loans, other than housing loan, vehicle loan, education loan, on consumer loan, is a caution, and that over-financialization should not happen. So on that front, I am myself worried, and I think RBI has risen to the occasion and come out with that circular, but I think we need to be little careful as to the consumer loans and the trend that is emerging, which is not very healthy. Thank you very much.
Okay, so before I get back to Dr. Surjit Bhalla, there are two particular... Yeah, hello. There are two particular areas that I would like Dr. Subhash Chandra Garg to comment on, because I don't think we've covered them at all. One was the question that I was asking Rima ji about the periodic labor force survey and how's the employment panning out. And second is the very important aspect of the Surjit Bhalla argument of poverty having diminished because of the food security that is provided. So you have any views on that? Because
Thank you. So on your first question about the labor survey, which Remaji was to respond, so I believe all of you are aware that the Modi government started in 2018 a system of labor survey, which is annual for the entire country and every quarter for the urban and the rural areas. That survey, now we have the data from 2018 onwards for 6 years. The data shows up, as far as the headline numbers are concerned, very clearly, that there is a very good increase in what we call labor force participation rate, LWFPR, which is that how many of the labor which is of 15 years and more is actually into the labor force, either working on jobs or looking for jobs. That is what the LWFPR measures, the labor force participation rate. That has gone for the 15 years and above from somewhere close to about 48% in 2018 to about 57% in 2023. That is a very good increase. If you 8 percentage point or about 11 to 12% increase is fabulous. So that should give a good mark to the fact that the employment is increasing. But there is a downside to this, and I would be failing in my duty to bring that downside also to the notice. When you drill down the data, where is the labor participation rate increasing, you first find that the increase in the rural areas and not urban areas. Whereas urban areas are supposed to be the employment generator, and the rural areas, which are basically the old agriculture labor and the farmers, should be coming down. But about 80 to 85% of the increase is concentrated in the rural area. Then you further drill down, then you find that amongst the rural area, it is basically the women who are getting. That should normally be good, but the data part that about 60-70% of the growth of labor participation in the rural areas is accounted by women. And if you further drill down, there is a category in the labor survey which is known as unpaid helper in family enterprise. That means somebody works in some family work but doesn't get paid. That is not a good kind of employment, so to say. If you're not getting paid, it's not. Whole purpose of employment is getting paid. You may get indirectly paid if the family income goes up, but that's not counted as. So, surprisingly, the largest increase is in this segment, the unpaid helper in family enterprise. Of the total about 8 points increase from 48 to 56, 57, about 40-45% is accounted for only by the unpaid helper in family enterprise. That, to my mind, sort of takes the sheen away from the increase, and if about 50% or 45% of increase in labor force is only in the unpaid family helper, which is another form of disguised employment in my judgment, it's not that sound a good thing. The second thing which you mentioned about the poverty, I think Surjit Bhalla is an authority on that. He will expound more. Basically, going by the larger national accounts data, there is a certain way the poverty is calculated, or you indirectly calculate by giving a value to the food which is provided. But as I said in the earlier comment, to my mind, the state of poverty is best captured by the state of malnutrition. If the malnutrition or undernourishment is going down in the country, then perhaps the poverty is, because the first instinct, first desire of anybody to do with his income is to eat. To be able to eat is the first human requirement of all that which we do in terms of jobs, etc. And that, as I said, if you look at only one of this indicator in the otherwise 11 or 12 indicators which the multidimensional poverty survey picks up, on this, if only one indicator is taken, about 40 to 45% of Indian households and individuals are still undernourished. So that, to my mind, if you take that, the poverty is still very deep rooted in the country.
Over to Surjit. You have a lot to.
No, very important points addressed here. Let me start with the nutrition. Let me start with the point of nutrition, which Mr. Garg has emphasized is the crucial indicator of poverty. I want to take you back to somewhere around 1980, when the World Bank used to measure, along with the rest of us, and forced us to start measuring poverty in terms of caloric consumption. That was the point about nutrition. The argument was, and this was by the World Bank, prior to the malnutrition in caloric indicator of poverty, India had measured poverty from 1962 in terms of total consumption, not just caloric consumption. So I did a study for the World Bank in 1980. I was asked to do a study on the measurement of poverty. This is my point about data and how it can be highly misleading if misused. And the World Bank was misusing the data, especially because there was a notion, look, food is necessary for survival. It's about the most important element in survival. And let's go and measure how much food they're eating. And how do you measure how much food they're eating? You measure it by their caloric consumption. So there was, the FAO had, according to age groups, 0 to 1, 0 to 5, 15 to 20, men, women, across all age groups, the FAO and the World Bank had indicators of how much was needed by each person. So there was a detailed study done in 1973. It's called the Haynes Nutrition Survey, where it was so careful that when they measured how much hamburgers you ate, they also measured how much oil went out in cooking. So they counted the calories correctly. What was the result? According to the World Bank, FAO norms, 80% of American women were considered malnourished. Now, as I write in that paper, a casual empiricism would tell you that obesity was a problem with American men and women, not malnourishment. Thankfully, about 10 years after that, in the 1990, when the World Bank and the rest of the world went back to what we originally had, which is you measure according to total consumption. And 10 years later, the whole caloric notion of nutrition was thrown out of the window. There was a very important Indian contributor to that, a person by the name of Sukhatme. And Sukhatme showed that the inter-individual variation between individuals, Indian economists really proved the point and allowed the world to get away from this notion of caloric consumption being an indicator of poverty, that he showed that there was large inter-individual variation which accounted for most of the differences in consumption. So I think, 40%, 40% of the Indian population is malnourished or lacks nutrition or is poor. In the face of all the evidence that there is in terms of, let's take the following, in terms of the food consumption that comes from wheat and rice is approximately, and for from 1950 onwards, and we know that from the surveys, has been around 9 kgs of either rice or wheat or bajra or whatever grains per person per month. That is the average that existed for a very long time. And as India has developed, as people have developed, as poverty has been reduced, that number has come down by about 10–15%. So when the government gave and is now giving 10 kgs per person per month for consumption, and their actual consumption is less, what you're finding out is that the poor who are getting this actually are getting some extra income, because what they are doing is selling this food in the marketplace. These are the poor. You and I don't get it. So across the board, poverty has been reduced by this policy of giving free food, which is in some sense no longer that necessary to alleviate poverty. Last point on poverty, which keeps coming up, and that is, and it's an important question, has the decline in poverty been greater? We have the large growth period of 2004 to 2011, or 2004 to 2013, and we have an equivalent 10 years or 8–9 years post 2013. No matter what data you look at, for the poor, and financial inclusion is just one of the indicators, that there has been a large decline in poverty 2011 onwards versus 2004 to 2011, which is considered that at that time universally acknowledged by me, by all, that poverty reduced at a fast rate. The interesting point is that poverty is reduced at a faster rate post 2011 than now. Last bit on, maybe I'm taking too much time, on labor force participation rate. What we have to answer before we get to the PLFS, the conventional wisdom in India amongst a certain group of intellectuals and researchers was that the female labor force participation rate, as given by CMIE, and today it gives the same, is less, around 10%, when the actual number is around 35%. So you can take out the family workers and you still have that the labor force participation rate in India has, for women, has really increased since about 2004 or 2011. And there are only 2 countries in the world that, according to CMIE, have a lower labor force participation rate than theirs, 10% or 8% or 9%. One is Yemen and one is Iraq. So what I'm trying to emphasize, be very careful with the data and what it is suggesting. Put the data to some tests, some simple smell tests, as I called in my 2002 book. Does it pass the smell test? And a lot of the data being propagated on political issues like poverty, etc., fail the smell test enormously.
Can I make a... So, I think I just want to make a comment on the poverty issue. You see, many times when we don't have the final good measurement of the real variable, we measure the intermediate. The whole point of food and nutrition is that the living condition, the health, height, weight of the person concerned should improve. And we always thought that by providing a certain kind of calorie consumption, this nutrition standard would be achieved. That was the whole rationale of the poverty data and the consumption data, calorie-based kind of World Bank, India, everywhere in the world, this whole started. What the multidimensional poverty index does is that it does not measure the nutrition by calorie consumption. We all know that India today is a hugely surplus country as far as food grains are concerned. We are the largest exporter of rice now. We have surplus wheat, and therefore our cereal production is much more than, it's a very different scene than 1950s and 60s when we had to import. But perhaps the nutrition is not all about cereals. It's not all about calories. There are many other things, minerals, vitamins, other kind of things which are perhaps needed to raise the real final test, which is whether you are well nutritioned, you're not undernourished, you're not stunted, you have right height for the age, you have right weight for the age, and those kind of indicators. So what MPI measures is, that's why I attach a lot of importance to that, not to the poverty data as measured by the World Bank or calorie consumption or indirectly by the income distribution, is this. And that is what worries me. If 45% or 40-45% of the households in India, according to MPI, are undernourished on that single criterion, I think I'm quite worried.
Thank you. So, do we have any questions from the audience, for anybody in the panel? So, let me move to Dr. Charan Singh then, if you could help us bring this together. So, with your final comments, I would also be asking a one-liner question. So, did you think ModiNomics delivered? The answer is yes or no.
Yes, it did a great job.
Surjit?
Absolutely yes.
Part yes, part no.
I think I am with him, part yes and part no.
Okay.
But with a caveat that I am speaking on behalf of MSMEs. Within the context of MSMEs, this is what I feel.
All right.
Where is the no part for MSMEs?
I said that because the factor markets, whether it is inputs of iron, steel, copper, aluminium, land, finance, they remain shackled and they have not been opened up. That's why.
So, if I can just ask, the MSMEs have suffered for a very long time,
Yes.
and you're absolutely right, and are still suffering. What is the delta? I think the most important thing in policy analysis is the change. So, have MSMEs conditions improved at a faster rate now in the last 10 years than in the previous 10 years?
Yes. Surely. Yes.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. You want to say something? I'll come to you. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I am Sunil Pandita from J&K Government. Sir, did demonetization help it in financial aspects, or did it hamper? Did it actually made us help in financial development, or it was a hindrance in economic activity?
So did demonetization help? Now let me just a minute. Let me just ask if there are any more questions.
Another question I want to ask you only, when you are making opening remarks that the fund that should be created for the purpose of subsidizing the interest rates, etc. So how far it is possible, and what kind of recommendation we can do to the government? That is the need of the hour.
So that recommendation we have done several times. The problem again, as I said, fintech bubble. The entire financial inclusion agenda has been hijacked by fintechs. It's become a technology problem. It is no longer a poverty problem. And that is where policy needs change. And I think all of us will have to bring a moral pressure to bear on powers that be, that poverty, livelihood linkage, cost of capacity building is still enormous. And my pet peeve, I was talking to SEBI, our markets are so shallow, and one of the executive directors told me that financial literacy should be a self-evident need. People should be so hungry for financial literacy, they should come to you. And I said, if they were so hungry for literacy, they wouldn't be poor. And to train one person on markets, financial literate, and to be certified in an exam, how much is paid by SEBI? Any guesses? That amount is a princely 50 rupees. So there you have an answer. Any other questions?
Thank you. So my question is regarding, you gave a very disturbing data on 40% of people being undernourished in the country. What was the actual unit of measurement? How was it measured?
Okay, so now on to demonetization and measurement, and then you could talk about the
Right. So,
cost of subvention.
I think demonetization was intended to basically reduce black economy or black money in the economy. And the assumption was that the cash represents black money. I have written extensively about it, so I won't take longer, but my broad conclusion is that this premise that cash equals black money is a wrong premise. Black money can exist in any form, whether you have cash or digital. If you want to take example of this Mahadev app, if 500 crores can be generated as black money, purely digital way of doing life. So cash is not equal to black money. And from that perspective, actually, it did not succeed. I'll just partly answer. Surjit can make much greater reference if required. The measurement is there. They have three indices. One is the belief that for your age, your weight should be a certain kind of weight. So the age-weight relationship tells you that if you don't have that weight for the age, then you are undernourished. Second indicator is that your height for your age should be better, right? So if you don't grow in terms of height, then so there are 2 or 3 of indicators, then there is a survey-based malnutrition. I would suggest this UNDP survey which happens, and now Niti Aayog is also bringing out this report. It explains in very great detail about so there are 3 indicators which go into the nutrition profiling. You may like to read that.
Thank you very much. But one last audience poll, since we are such an enlightened audience, just by a show of hands, how many of you feel ModiNomics delivered? And the people who have not raised their hand, would you raise? Okay, how many feel it did not deliver? So one person feels not delivered, about 50% feel delivered, and the balance is can't say. It's a very safe choice. Thank you very much.